Morning, everybody. I'm not sure that y'all can talk to me, although I think you can request to speak, but you can also communicate via the chat. It's good to see you all. Give it about another 30 seconds or a minute. We got people jumping on right now. That's great. About 5 of you. Good. And I believe I am sharing my screen. Somebody let me know if they can see a big skeleton on there, as well as my bright, smiling, handsome face. Yeah, I am sharing. Okay, good. Still kind of getting used to this program, but I think I got it down. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is recorded. You will get a link in your email after it is finished. At some point, I'm not sure how quickly that comes, but where you can download and relook at the whole thing if you wish. I am planning on doing this most Mondays, except when I'm out of town. Right now, I've got it scheduled through January. I'm doing 3 weekends in January, and then I'm at Sherman teaching, so I won't be doing it that particular Monday. And then I will publish the February dates a little bit later this month. So the one thing I want to make sure that you know is that this is not a tutorial for whatever program you're using to look at DICOM images or 3D images or cone beam CT scan images. Most people out there are using Carestream 3D, which is the free version you can get on Windows. Good program. It's got a very good system. I prefer Mac, and I have this one, which is free, but costs a little bit to make sure you don't get the window that says not for medical purposes on it. I don't remember all the details. I've been using it for several years now, and so I'm fairly comfortable answering questions about this particular program, but that is not really what this is for. This really is just to go through a practical analysis, Blair analysis of the upper cervical spine. And so it's the theories and the philosophies and the that you want to take away with you. Exactly how I do things. If you're using a different program, maybe a little bit different. You'll have to learn the programs that you're using. And most of these programs have good tutorials on YouTube and things like that. But anyway, this is not a tutorial for my program. On the screen in front of you, you should be able to see the 3D version of a 33-year-old male. Came in last week, a couple of weeks ago, I think. And, oh, that is not what I wanted to do. Let's get out of there. Out of there, good. Okay, so first thing I usually do is pull up the 3D version. Now, I don't do, and we do not recommend doing your full analysis on this. Every program is a little bit different. We don't know about the reliability, but it can give you a very good overall idea of what's going on in the spine. And so I usually will just take a look. Sometimes I'll slice through it, but I'll take a look and say, okay, look, he's got, wow, right, atlas looks like it's tilted down on the left head. I don't know, is it tilted down on the right? That's an interesting presentation. It looks like here we're seeing a possible inferior, posterior inferior slip of the C2 facet on C3, maybe even also C3 on C4. So typically I'll just kind of write these things down so that when we move to the next screen, and there's also possibly a posterior there, I'm looking at where the edge of the facet is compared to the one below. And if you draw a line along the facet and then draw a 90-degree angle, in fact, I can do this to some degree. This is going to be, I think, a little bit messy, but because it doesn't do a real straight line, and that's a weird color. But 90 degrees to that, then the edges should line up. The problem with the 3D is you can't really tell where the edge is sometimes because you can't see the facet hardened surface, the thicker cortex where the joint is. So we just take this as a something to look at later. Also, I'm seeing that C1 looks like it's rotated a little bit posterior on C2. On the right side, a little bit anterior, and I like looking at this back version. We can talk about that later, but that's the front doesn't seem to always be lined up even when everything is normal, but we are seeing what looks like rotation of C1 on C2, and the back I think is more important because that's the part that's closest to the central nervous system. All right, I'm not able to see really clearly what's going on here between C0 and C1, so I'm not going to worry about it. We take a look straight down. It does look like C1. What I'm trying to do is balance, so I'm looking straight down through the skull. It does look like we're seeing more of C1 here than over here, so it could have gone forward to the right, is a possibility. But again, we don't want to use that as our main issue. We can definitely see that C1 is rotated forward on the left on C2, and it looks like backwards on the right. So we have, if we're looking at it in this direction, it looks like we have a clockwise rotation of C1 on C2. Okay, so that's going to finish that. Let me switch my screen share to, if I can find it. Okay. All right. So here is what typically, when you pull up a DICOM on most programs, it'll have something like this. We've got the three different axes. We've got the lateral, the vertex, the coronal. It's going to be at your minimum measurement, which for my machine is a 0.3 millimeters. Typically, the radiologists I've talked to say that the smallest you want to look at something is probably about a 3 millimeters. So we're not gonna stay here at the 0.3. The other thing you'll notice on this is that the reading left is the right. Now, if that's what you're comfortable with, that's great. It's not what I learned as a chiropractor. I learned to look at people from the back and from the top down. So some programs you can switch that automatically. CareStream, you can just set it up so it always pulls it up so the right is on the right and the left is on the left. This one doesn't do that, so I'm going to switch it here. Orientation, flip horizontal. I only flipped one. I need to, typically, before I pull it up, I need to flip it, so now I have to flip each one of them. Good. Horizontal. And this one, just so that it all stays. All right, so now the right is on the right, the left is on the left. That's typically how we look at it. If you're comfortable doing it the other way, that's fine. If you're sharing with people across the pond, across the Atlantic, or other parts of the world, you just may want to point out that you've done that, so when they're looking at your pictures, they realize it. We don't always check. It's a good idea to always check, but we don't always do that. Now, this guy came in. I sat him in the machine. I have a machine that's a seated machine as opposed to a standing. I got him in his normal head carriage. And typically what you'll see in the Blair manual is that we want to measure to the bottom of the screen or to whatever level is. Now, some machines, some CT scan machines don't have a straight edge across the top. Okay, so we don't want to assume that. My machine does. Some machines, though, are more of a cone, and so you're going to want to look at this line across here, and there's usually going to be a button somewhere where you can reset. You see it up here in the top right, reset it back. Every program I found will take you back to this position. Now, do we want to measure that to the ground? That is the traditional Blair way to do it. So we're just going to keep doing it that way. Now that we're using cone beam CT scan and we can manipulate things a little bit better, I think there's some better ways, but let's not worry about that right now. Okay, so I'm going to change this to, I'm going to go ahead and go to 10 millimeters. Most of the time, this is about what I'm using to analyze things. We've got things fairly in the center. Good. And I can do a lot of different measurements from here. I like to measure the clival-axial angle and things like that, but we're just looking just at the Blair thing. And the first thing we do in the Blair series is we are going to look at the convergence angles of the atlas. So I'm just going to scroll down till I can get a good picture of the top atlantoaxial joints. I'm going to go ahead and change this to be along the convergence or the sagittal AP plane line. And I have a fairly good view of the top of the atlas. Now we go over here and we can see that I'm including all parts of the joint. 20 millimeters is actually pretty good for analyzing these. The problem is with cone beams, the thicker the slice, the less resolution you have. And so it's a trade-off. When you're looking at a digital x-ray, of course, the resolution is awesome and you got a full thickness slice. But in this case, we're going to take 10 as kind of a happy medium. And we are going to analyze the convergence angles. So I'm going to enlarge my atlas right there. We're going to get rid of the crosshair so I can see it. We're going to look at the lateralmost margin of this groove up here where the anterior arch meets the lateral mass on both sides. And we're going to look back here at where the posterior arch meets the lateral mass. Now, Dr. Blair, when he was doing x-rays, would use the foramen magnum where it crosses over. But in order to see that, we have to really thicken our slice or do some other gymnastics. And we found that in general, right now, we haven't tested it 100%, but it seems to work fine just to use the posterior arch. That was an alternate that Dr. Blair said we could use. So we're just going to go ahead and use that. It seems to work. So I'm going to put a dot there. I'm going to put a dot there. This is my 90-degree angle, and I'm going to come straight out. So I got 90 to 93, so I'm going to close that just a bit till we get to 90. Very good. Now I'm going to do the same thing on going the other direction. "90 degrees. That was almost pretty exact. Pretty close. Good. Get that out of the way. Now let's go over here, do the same thing. Boom. Thinking if I did some videos on this to give away later, I would like make this part go. Right, Gordon, let's do this. Speed it up. Do one side slow, speed up the other. So sorry, when it's live, you just get it all same speed. All right, so we have come out here to the edge. Now, in the Blair manual, it talks about outlining the edges. When you're doing a cone beam and you're in the right spot, it seems kind of superfluous. Now you notice that perhaps I can go out here. There's a little bit of, it looks like through the IVF, there may be something there, but this is nice, really nice and clear. Now we need to find the 50% mark or the halfway point through each of those lines and mark that. A lot of people will eyeball it Yeah, let's do it properly today. What we're going to do is I'm going to come up here, find out. Okay, let's get that out of the way. Very good. How long is that? 7.6, so 3.5, 3.75 is about the half mark. 3.7. When we're talking about tenths of millimeters, I think that's pretty good. Now you notice I didn't line it up exactly, and that's because if I put this line right on top of the other line and then moved away and did something else, I wouldn't be able to find it again. So I angle it just a hair so I can see about where that is. And we're going to do the same thing over here. 1.2, so we're talking about a 6. Good. Get that guy out of the way. And now I'm going to mark it. With this Horos program, these lines do not stick around when you move. With Carestream 3D, those lines will stay there even when you manipulate away, and they totally are inaccurate. So pluses and minuses, but here we go. These dots, however, will stay in this 3D spot with this particular program. Okay, so those are going to be there, and then we're going to come down here, do the same thing on the other side. 9, so 4.5. I am not, I'm not stupid, but I'm not always the best mathematician, at least when my mind is on something else. So if I end up making a mistake here, just kindly correct me. Where were we? 13, so that's what, 6.5? What was it? 13 point, about 14. So let's go closer to 7. Yeah, I don't want to go that far. Boom. All right, now we're going to mark those. All right. This is our crosshairs. Now, I want to make sure that these are lined up. There's a whole thought process as to where we're going to have our center mark. And like I said, we're kind of doing it the way Blair did it, because that's the way it was tested and because there isn't too much of a reason to change. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going through the ear canals. You notice I just make sure it's balanced on both sides. I didn't have to rotate at all. This guy, unlike most people, happened to be looking straight forward after we went through the exercise. So now we're going to go back down. You can see how my lines all disappeared once I moved away. However, we still have the dots there, and we now have where our center line is. So we are going to figure out our convergence angles. I'm going to put a dot here. I'm going to run a line through this. You see it goes through the center of that line. Boom. All right. Left convergence angle, 23.4. There are questions. Feel free to use the chat function. I'm keeping an eye on it. All right, now typically what I'll do is anytime I come up with an analysis or I find something interesting, I go ahead and take a screenshot or a picture. You can do that sometimes within the program. You can save it as a DICOM, you can save it as a JPEG, a TIFF. I just do screenshots on the Mac. They're really easy. Screenshot the whole, not the whole screen of my computer, but the whole window. Save it as a JPEG, and then take all the screenshots and combine them into a PDF. Mac makes that really easy. So that's what I do, and I put it in their file, as well as my analysis sheet where I've written everything down. So I'll have written down 23.5 for the left, 18.8 for the right, and on my cheat sheet, my report, my analysis report, but I'll also take a screenshot so that I can see how I did it. All right, now what we need to do, the second thing is we need to look at each side and measure the slope and convexity. So we're going to come down here. we're going to rotate. Now, once you start rotating, so there's two different kinds of motion. There's translation, which is just going forward and backward, side to side, whatever, along a particular line. And then there's rotation on all three axes. You've got all three of your axes. You can translate and you can rotate. Pretty simple stuff. Once you start rotating, your what's down and up and sideways is going to change a little bit. So if you only rotate in one direction, then the other directions are going to maintain at 90 degrees. Now you'll notice that I had this, I had changed this to the convergence angle. I mean to the, I had already rotated once to the slope, not the slope, the sagittal C1 AP plane line. And so now when I've rotated this, this is still pretty level with the ground, but this one probably isn't. You can see along here how things have started to change and to rotate. So what I need to do is I need to go back, reset, which unfortunately means I need to go back and put this in here. I'm going to go ahead and put it at a 10, again, 10 millimeters. We're going to come back in. Let's find our ears. Usually what I'll do, I have a different process for finding the center of the skull, but usually what I'll do, and let's just go ahead and do it this time, even though we know that for this particular guy, his head was straight forward, I'm going to go ahead and mark that so that I don't have to keep remeasuring it in the future. So we've got those points, which will always stay there. Okay, now let's go back down. Everything is straight. We're straight on the sagittal view, on the lateral view. We're straight on the AP view. We're straight on the vertex, and we want to measure the slope angle for both sides. All right, now where do we measure? We measure at the lateralmost margin. Well, take that back. All we're doing right now is we're going to measure the slope angle. So I'm going to come back here to the kind of the center of the joint. The slope angle, which we're going to see over here. So here's the Blair protracto view. And we're going to, and if we have a thick enough slice, we could actually see all the way over here. And this is where Dr. Blair would measure the convexity, kind of saved on taking more x-rays. And the convexity was good enough for what he needed it for, which is to determine in general how steep it is and also to use for some of the adjustments. But we can actually get a more pure convexity if we actually look over here, because now we're coming in 90 degrees to the joint. And these two will be similar, but this isn't coming, this is a off sides or off center convexity. So we could measure the right slope and the left convexity here, or the right slope and the right convexity here, and just measure the left convexity when we do the same thing on the other side. So that's what I'm going to do. And this is still level with the ground, so we're going to come in here, get rid of that so that's not in my way anymore. Now we're going to measure the whatever side of the joint we are adjusting to. So if the atlas is misaligned with the skull, we're going to measure the skull. Usually they're about the same. Sometimes they're a little bit different. So it's just a good idea to always measure what you're adjusting to, not the one that's misaligned, because it's misaligned. Now I'm going to see, did I draw that bottom line 90 degrees to the ground, level with the ground? Pretty much. Just bring that up just a hair. Okay, so we've got 48 on that side. Now we're going to measure the posterior 1/3 of the convexity. So here's the convexity. Here's the posterior 1/3. It's going to be a straight line. Not a curvature. So you're going to take, your best approximation of that curvature, and it's usually pretty easy to figure out. Create a straight line along it, and then line it up with the ground. So we got a 28 degree convexity on the left and a 48 degree slope, on the right, and a 48 degree slope on the right. We mark that down. Now we can look here and see if that looks lined up. But again, we're at a we're at a 10 millimeter. It's kind of hard to see. It's not super clear. I'm going to wait for a moment. I'm going to go measure the other side because everything is set up to do the measurements. And then we can start twisting and turning and not have to worry about where our crosshairs are as far as level to the ground or not. So I'm going to come over here and do the left side next. Let's get that approximately the same. Good. We're going to back it up so that we can see the joint. The interesting thing, most people will have two fairly distinct pads, sometimes two entirely separate pads on the at the AO joint, and we are mostly concerned with the front pad. That was where Dr. Blair determined it was going to be most accurate. So I'm going to kind of head it in there. We'll talk about where we're going to look when we're analyzing the joint. So right now, all we're doing, remember, is measuring things. Good, we're all set. Perfect. Good. Get that out of there. Hold on, folks. There we go. Let's see how close I am. Doing pretty good today. Out of convention, I always just use, I create a longer line so I remember what my reference point is. Sometimes when you're looking at something and you've got measurements, you might not remember what your reference point is. All right, so we're at 39.2 for the left slope. Here is the left convexity. We're going to take the posterior 1/3, which is about there. Line it up with our reference point, so we got 27.8. Okay, so now we've got our 4 measurements for the AO joint. I assume everybody's following along pretty closely. I don't see any questions in the chat. Hopefully that function is working. Okay, so we've got our measurements. We still don't know how it's misaligned or even if it is misaligned. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. It's not super clear, so I'm actually going to line up, and you can do this anywhere. Just be careful not to use your measurements after you start twisting on more than 2 axes. But we're going to go right along the joint here. And now look how clear things are. Now I want you to be careful. It seems like if the joint goes forward, we would see the misalignment here. But what Dr. Blair found out was on an ellipsoidal joint. An ellipsoidal joint is shaped like this, like an oval, and its primary motion is along the long axis. Secondary motion is along the wide axis or the width. And he found that the joints between the skull, let's see if I can do this where you can see it, and the atlas weren't exactly mirror images. One would often end before the other just because of that motion. So that was not a good spot to see if it was misaligned or not. It was often not lined up, even when there was normal, when everything was normal. What we want to look for is we want to look at this lateral edge, because if it's gone too far forward on the other side, it'll have pushed it off. And so we're going to look at that edge right there and see, okay, it's misaligned. Now, what spot on the joint do we look at? So we're not going to be looking at the front. We're going to look at the lateral margin. Now, this is technically this is the anterolateral margin, but you could say this whole thing here is the anterolateral margin. So we took this, now it's changed a little bit because I've started rotating on more than one axis, but we're going to find the part that is furthest away along that line. So parallel to the long axis, where's the furthest part away in the anterior part of the joint? And that's about right there. So I'm going to move this forward just a little bit. Now I can't really see the joint over here. It looks still pretty cloudy. So what we're going to do, we're going to come back over here, and now we're going to create a line that is parallel to that edge of that circle. Forgot off the top of my head what that's called. It's got a technical term. I use it at my seminars all the time. Tangential line, maybe. Now suddenly, wow, over here is looking a lot better. So let's get rid of that crosshairs And that looks pretty darn good. Now I can rock this back and forth. Now, if you get to the point where you're thinking, man, is that misaligned? I mean, that could be like a millionth of a millimeter. If you're having to really guess, best scenario is to assume it's level or even until proven otherwise with patient care. So that one looks like, wow, if we look at it super, super close, we might have a little bit of an anteriority, superiority of C1 on C2, but reality is it's looking pretty close. So I might make a note if I was really unsure, might have gone AS on the left, that's an ASL, and put a little question mark by it, and then when I go examine the patient, see if there's any neurological reason to assume that. But at this point, I'm just going to leave it alone. All right, let's go look at the other side. Oh, what I'll do is I'll circle it and take a picture for my reference later. Patients can look. I usually go over these with the patients as well once I've created the PDF with all the pictures. All right. Okay, possible ASL, but it's very, very small if it is, and a very small one can exist. Next thing we're going to do is go look at the other one. So let's go over here. Now we're all twisted up in all kinds of different directions, but at this point, that's not going to matter too much as long as we can get where we want to go. So we're going to line up here, here, along the joint, boom. All right, so we kind of we've recreated where we were before without having to go all the way back and reset, which you can always do. Sometimes that's easier. Now I'm going to change all my vertices to be along the joint. Okay, so we're along the joint, we're along the joint, along the joint. Okay, I got a couple of questions. Give me a second. And I'm going to pull back so that I'm parallel to this outside edge, the most lateral edge. This one also looks pretty well lined up. So let's just look around it. We're looking at, if we go too far forward, because the joints are not mirror imaged on the front, you can start to get an overlap that makes it an ASL. So that, even though that looks like a misalignment, I know that I'm too far forward on that joint, or I suspect I am. So when I come back, it levels out. Okay. Okay, look. So possibly if I determine that he is misaligned, ASL, I mean, if he is misaligned at the AO joint, it's probably that ASL. Because looking here, I'm saying this is even. And if I look really close, I don't even see it. Now, remember, when we were looking at that 3D image, it looked like the atlas had gone forward to the right. If you just look at the general bone structure, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing that it's gone forward to the left at the AO joint. All right, since I've finished looking at the AO joint, let's go take a look at the questions. Javier, okay, you got two questions. Okay, so you want me to go over again how on a condylar joint the surfaces aren't the same, so we measure the lateral side, right? So what we have to remember about a condylar joint is it's an ellipsoidal joint. Okay, two sides to it, of course, the top and the bottom, or the condyle and the superior articulating facet of C1. And what Dr. Blair's original thesis was that it was a mirror image. Those two joints were mirror image. Goes back to somites. They're the same somite in embryology, and they separate. So it's like taking a piece of cake or something and cutting it. The two edges should fit all the way around, top to bottom, mirror images, correct? Well, what he found is that even though they are somites, we're not sure why, suspect gravity and further development, the front and the back of the joint are not mirror images. However, the lateralmost edge, and it might have something to do with weight, how gravity is pushing the head down onto the skull, but the lateral edge of that joint, so when you're looking at the joint and we're looking at that outside edge, that's the edge that should line up. If you're looking at the front, the atlas may be larger than the condyle. When you're looking at the back, it really gets all kinds of screwy and messed up. Probably it just has to do with the kind of motion that we have at that joint. So we're not 100% sure. Anyway, it's that outside lateral margin. So that's the part we want to be careful to look at. And it can be, if you follow the steps, then for most cases, it's going to be fairly obvious. There's going to be odd cases, and sometimes I'm going to pull those up, like this one, where it's like, wow, it's not super obvious, but of the two, it looks like the C1 has gone a little bit lateral to C0, or the occiput, on the left side. And based on how things move, that means we would have an anterior superior left misalignment in order to get that kind of a that kind of a misalignment, which is a whole nother lecture on how the atlas moves, the biomechanics of the atlas and the occiput. Okay, Javier, I hope I did that okay. Let's go on. So now we've looked at, I believe, oh, there is one more measurement we need to get, so let's go ahead and reset. And let's change it back to 10 millimeters. The other thing that you can do when you're not sure is you can start thinning the slices. The problem was then you've got to be really careful that you're in the right spot. Otherwise, you can be looking at a thin slice just off of where you need to be and not see the right thing. The other thing we need to measure now that we'll need for the adjustment is the atlas sagittal AP plane line. Now, there's a lot of different ways that people measure these. Different upper cervical techniques do it in different ways. The way Dr. Blair did it, the way that's the most useful for this, we don't need to be super complicated. We're just going to look at the anterior tubercle and the posterior arch, and we're going to bisect the posterior part of the anterior tubercle and the anterior part of the posterior arch, which, if they have a cleft posterior arch, sometimes can be a little challenging. That's just not typical though. So I'm going to find center, draw my reference line, and then I'm going to double check my reference line that it's pretty good. All right, so now we have the AP plane line at 13.8. Okay, now I use the tenths. I think a lot of people just, I mean, we're talking about degrees that are small, and when you're putting your arm next to somebody to do the adjustment, you're probably going to be a few degrees off. I like to be as accurate as possible because I know I'm going to be a few degrees off. And so I want to look at that and think, okay, 14. It's 13.8, 14 degrees. Probably doesn't make any difference to my treatment at all. So do what you want with that one. I definitely wouldn't round up to the nearest fifth of 5 degrees, but round up to the nearest degree. I just always like putting in that tenth so that I know what's going on there. Okay, so we have everything we need to adjust the atlanto-occipital joint. Now, there are different options in the Blair technique as to which adjustment to use to adjust the AO joint. For the anterior superior misalignments, we have 3. 1 on the side of laterality, 2 on the other. Remember that the AO joint is an ellipsoidal joint, right? With the primary motion being anterior posterior. That means primary misalignment is not laterality. It depends on the angle of the joint that's gone too far forward. So if the right side has gone too forward and it's a 90-degree joint, then yeah, laterality it's going to be pure laterality. It's just that usually they're 18 to 33 degrees, which means that the primary misalignment, direction of misalignment, is going to be anterior or posterior. So it depends on that angle of the tracking side, the side that's not misaligned, that's gone too far forward or too far backward. Again, that gets into another lecture on biomechanics. So different options, we can take those measurements we have and look at those and look at different options. One thing that I think that Dr. Blair never really addressed was when you have an AA misalignment, a rotation of C1 on C2, then maybe you're going to want to use an adjustment that's going to help correct that. Even if it isn't a primary, even if it's a compensation, why push something further into a compensation, why not do an adjustment that takes care of that? So I like to look at those joints. So, and again, we can line up our axes so that we can see things pretty clear. Translate back and forth. All right. So I've got a C1 is posterior on the right side, like we saw on the 3D version. It's posterior on the right. Now, if we go over to the left side, as a matter of interest, there have been a few cases where I felt like the AA joint actually was the primary problem. There's been a few cases where I thought it was and it wasn't. So this is a compensation either due to, in most cases, a compensation either due to the AO misalignment or the C2-on-3 misalignment. My favorite case there is somebody that had a posterior, kind of like this one, but it was huge posteriority of C1 on C2 on the right side. And I figured out a way to adjust it based on Blair's adjustment style, and which had worked for other people where it was a primary. There's been a very few, and it never seemed to clear, or would clear for a very short period of time. And I realized that it was a C2-on-3 misalignment that I couldn't see clearly. So C2 had gone forward and superior on C3, pushing the atlas forward underneath pushing the axis forward underneath C1. And so I was getting that and I kept trying to fix it here, when in reality I just needed to fix the C2 on C3 misalignment. Then the person started holding and we got better results. Anyway, so I'll take a mark of that. The last thing that we're going to do, or the next thing that we're going to do, where are we on time? We've got about 20 minutes left, is we are going to look at the C2, 3, and lower joints. Okay, so let's bring this back up. In this case, let's see, we're going back to 10. Now, what Dr. Blair determined here is that the gold standard spot to look at, kind of like that lateral margin on C0, C1, the best spot to look for here for the mirror image is the anterior portion of the joint. So you've got the inferior articular facet of C2, superior articular facet of C3, and it's where those fingertips are where you're going to want to look. Now, in the back, you can kind of get a hint of what's going on, but because of how things move and gravity and so forth, those are often misshapen. Or misshapen may be the wrong word, but they're not mirror images. The lateral margins as well on these. So there's some different things you can look at, and if we have time, we'll go over those, but the primary thing is going to be the anterior margin. So the first thing I'm going to do here, since everything, I just lined up everything, right? It's all square. So now I'm going to measure these joints so that I know how to adjust if I need to. Make sure that my reference point is indeed actually level. Good. And with this program, I can copy paste. I don't have to keep redoing that bottom line. And you'll notice I always move my lines away from the joint. So when I take that picture, I don't have those in the way. So I'm not analyzing yet. All I'm doing is measuring. This is the left side. So we know the slope angle for the C3 superior articulating facet is 55 degrees. For the C4 is 32. And for the C5, C5 is 36. Okay. Now, I'm not analyzing these yet. And this one, like most of the time, C2-on-3 has some facet tropism. So I could skinny down my slice. But before we do that, let's just line everything up. So here's the anterior margin that I'm going to want to look at. And we're going to move this around to here. So now we've got the slope. Now I can see that on the left, more than the right, we have that tropism. This is kind of shallow for most people. Most people seem to have a little bit more. But now notice I've got a fairly clear view over here. All right. Let's bring that up so that you can see better. Okay, so I've got a wedge. Notice I got an anterior wedge in the joint. That's going to give me a clue. But really what I want to know is when I come down here, that hard facet pad, it seems to end right here. And this one seems to end about right here. Okay, which is not 90 degrees to that joint. So if I took a line here and made it 90 degrees, this looks anterior. Interesting. When we looked at it from the on the 3D version, it looked posterior. Okay, but when we're actually looking at the surfaces of the joints, it looks anterior. Always bugs me when it's not real close, but there we go. All right. So I'm thinking, even though this looks posterior, and we've got an anterior wedge, which often would indicate a posteriority, this looks like it's anterior. So I'm going to look a little bit closer. I'm going to rock this back and forth. Still looks like it's a little anterior. I'm going to rotate around the outside edge. Still looks a little anterior. I'm going to thin it. Let's go all the way down to 3. Okay, now this is interesting. As we come in and as we go out, we're seeing a little bit different. So this is going to be one of those complicated cases. I don't know if this is misaligned anterior superior, posterior inferior. I've got some hints, the anterior wedge, the posteriority here, that it might be posterior. When I go out to the edge a little bit, it's starting to look like it slid backwards, which is probably what we caught when you were looking at the 3D version, which is why we don't want to trust that. And we come over here. So I'll probably do some poking around on the patient, see if there is any interference there and what direction it might be using some other tools. But what I'm going to write down is that it looks like it's an ASL, probably in my, or an ALS, probably in my notes. I'll put a question mark next to that. All right, let's look some of these others. Looks pretty straight across if you draw that 90-degree angle. So that one was looking like a possible misalignment. All right. Let's get this recentered. Good. I don't necessarily look super close at these unless I think there might be something going on. So I do a general view. It looks anterior, posterior. I might go look a little bit closer if it's not obvious. The next place we can look is the parasagittal George's line, and we can see if it's lined up or not. If for example, C2 George's line was in front of the C3 parasagittal George's line on the left side, that might indicate that C2 had gone anterior. But that part of that's going to depend on the angle. You know, if you've got a fairly flat angle and it's gone anterior, that's going to push the body forward enough to probably be visible. But if you have an average or a steep slope angle, then it's going to more cause a disc wedge. It's going to go more up than forward. And so there might be a disc wedge, which might be something we look at. It's just harder to be really detailed on those. So we're not there yet. So right now, I'm looking at George's line, and you can tell things aren't quite what they should be, but it looks like they're mostly lined up there on the left side. So let's go over here to the right side. Okay, we're going to take our measurements. Boom, boom, boom. I'm not going to go through that again, but it would be somewhere like that, and we would measure all of those. But let's look at the joints and see if we can figure out what's going on. So here's C2-3 on the right side. I've lined up, and boom. All right, now we're looking straight down the joint. We're looking straight down here. You can see that. We can look around the anterior edge. Again, we've got an anterior angle here, which may indicate a posteriority. The back looks pretty lined up. The gold standard, of course, is that anterior edge. It looks pretty straight right across there. So that anterior wedge is coming from something else. Okay, and look at George's line. George's line looks pretty lined up. So we're going to look first at that anterior margin. If it's not clear, then you can look at the others to give you a hint. All right, but again, those are hints. They're not 100% every time. If we look down here, okay, I got 10 minutes left. Let's just do this, and then we're going to cover a couple other things. That one might be a little anterior. I don't want to come out to the outside edge, but it's not super clear here. So I'm just going to leave it. The issue using a cone beam is a lot easier to analyze these C2 and lower joints, but it's still not slam dunk because the cortex of the pars often will run into the cortex of the joint, the inferior articulating surface. So it's hard to figure out sometimes where that joint ends. So it's nice to be able to kind of look at it several ways. Look at the 3D version again, work around like that. But at least you've got the measurements. If something comes up on your physical exam and you're convinced that that's a subluxation there, you know how to misalign it. Please don't misalign it. You probably know how to do that too. But you know how to realign it. Now, here's, let's go back to reset. Let's bring it to back to the 10 millimeters. A couple of things I want to look at. Let's look at the wedging. That ought to be fairly self-explanatory. Let's go down to, let's go back down to 3 actually. All right, look, we've got a disc wedge there between 2 and 3. So open on the right could indicate that it's gone up and superior on the right, or posterior inferior on the left. So we saw that it's possible that it's gone posterior inferior on the left. It wasn't clear. The anterior margin of the joint seemed fairly clear, so I'm probably going to leave it where it is. But I'm thinking maybe that's rotated there. Same thing here, all the way down. These look pretty good. The last thing I'm going to do before I sign off is I'm going to line this up and just run myself up. If I'm right on the center here, going through the center of that triangle back here, I'm just going to scroll up and see if there's any rotations, because that might give me a clue. All right, so 2, 3, 4 on 5 doesn't seem to be rotated. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be a double anterior or a double posterior, but it means that probably I'm not, and because I didn't see it anywhere else, I'm not suspicious that it's gone forward on one side or the other, or backwards on one side or the other, or forward on one side or backwards on the other. So we don't have any rotation there. We're going to go up one more. No rotation. Let's go between C2 and 3. All right. And it changed angle because of that wedge. So I'm going to change this to be more in the center. Maybe there's a rotation there, but yeah, it does look like there's a bit of a rotation. I'm going to check out C2 on 3 on this guy, because you'll notice that the posterior margin here now is angled a little bit compared to my blue line, and the apex has gone off to the right just a little bit. So it looks like this is rotated counterclockwise in relationship to 3, which could indicate either a C2 on 3 ARS or a C2 on 3 PRI. All right, so those are the clues, and we've gone through the whole analysis. I don't see any other questions. I'll hang out for a minute or so. Remember that this is being recorded, and you can get and go through. You can always text me, call me, email me as well with questions. I have no problem with that. I hope you have a great Monday, and I'll be back here next Monday at 10 a.m. Central to do the same thing on a different case. And if there are some questions, maybe send me a case if you've got one. I can evaluate it and see if it's something I want to do. I'll anonymize it, or you could anonymize it before you send me if you know how to do that. And then we can do those together as well. Great to have all of you. It looks like there was one more either question or just a thank you from Gerard. Dr. Gerard, good to see you on here. I will talk to you guys later. Hiroki, good to see you on there. Have a good day, whatever's left of it.